Chapter 1. It was a Wednesday afternoon in late June, and the vicarage garden was in splendid bloom. Foxgloves rose like purple trumpets along the hedge, and the ancient mulberry tree cast dappled shade across a white linen tea-table, attended by the usual assortment of village personalities, each seated smiling and sipping like actors unaware of the tragedy soon to unfold. Miss Marple sat in a cane-backed chair near the lilac bush, her teacup steady in hand. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Diana Litchfield, had invited her, as she always did, for what she cheerily called a genteel little tea with her most inoffensive acquaintances, which of course included Miss Marple. "I do think," Mrs. Litchfield was saying with a flourish of shortbread fingers, "that Widow's Mead Lane has quite improved since the Hargreaves widow moved in. Such quiet dignity. Doesn't you think, Miss Marple?" Miss Marple smiled politely, dabbing her lips with a folded napkin. "Mrs. Hargreaves has a most discreet air, though quietness," she added gently, "is sometimes merely the absence of visible noise." The group tittered in confusion or polite agreement, except for one. At the edge of the table sat Mrs. Edith Hargreaves herself, clad in deepest mourning despite her husband having passed more than a year prior. Her gloved hands were wrapped tightly around her teacup, and her eyes, not watery with grief but sharp and dry, watched everyone a little too attentively. She had the habit of nodding before others had finished speaking, as though anticipating the end of each sentence. Next to her, the local solicitor, Mr. Oswald March, attempted conversation with mild courtesy. "I hear the roses at Widow's Mead are coming in strong this year. That old trellis must still be doing its job." "It is," Mrs. Hargreaves replied coolly, "unlike some things that collapse when no one is looking." There was a brief silence. Mr. March chuckled, uncertain whether it was meant to be a joke. Miss Marple, however, did not chuckle. From across the lawn came a burst of carefree laughter. The vicar's daughter, Beatrice, was feeding crumbs to a cluster of sparrows near the sundial. Her laughter rang light and careless, and Miss Marple noticed how sharply Mrs. Hargreaves turned her head at the sound. Not jealousy, no, something more curious. Irritation, perhaps, or fear. The tea continued in fits of strained cheer, punctuated by small gossip and bits of cake. Colonel Withersby, red-faced and ever puffing at a pipe, grumbled about the price of barley. Miss Merton, a spinster of firm opinions, confided to Miss Marple that she thought it positively unnatural for a widow to wear mourning longer than 6 months. "Morbid," she whispered, "clinging to shadows. There's something theatrical about it." Later, as the sun dipped and shadows lengthened, Mrs. Hargreaves rose, brushing a phantom crumb from her skirts. "Thank you, Mrs. Litchfield. A pleasant gathering," she said, "but I must be going before the light fails." "But you live only 3 minutes away," cried Miss Merton. "Still," said the widow, with a small smile, "I find dusk to be a time for caution." She walked away with the brisk step of one practiced in silent exits. Miss Marple watched her go. No one else seemed to notice the way the widow paused at the garden gate and looked back, just for a moment, as if checking something or someone. And then she disappeared down the lane between the hedges. It was the last time anyone would see her. Chapter 2. The morning after the vicarage tea dawned clear and golden, with a breeze that rustled through the hedgerows and stirred curtains left ajar. At number 7 Widow's Mead Lane, however, no curtains moved, no kettle whistled, no front door clicked open with its usual precision. By 9:30, Mrs. Brisket, who lived opposite and believed it her civic duty to notice things, frowned as she trimmed her rosebush. "She sits usually up and out by now," she murmured to herself. "Shopping by 8, dead plants off the porch by 9. Routines are sacred to that one." At 9:45, her curiosity got the better of her. Mrs. Brisket crossed the lane, knocked 3 times on the Hargreaves' painted blue door, and waited. No answer. She tried the bell. It buzzed, but only silence replied. After a moment's hesitation, she peered in through the side window, the lace curtain not quite meeting the sill. She saw the sitting room, neat, untouched, and oddly lifeless. The teacup from the previous evening sat on the sideboard. The clock ticked steadily, but the widow herself was absent. By midday, the news had travelled, as it inevitably did in St. Mildred's Close, with the speed and elegance of creeping ivy. The widow had vanished. Miss Marple, returning from the greengrocer with a half-pound of shelled peas, found Mrs. Litchfield standing on the vicarage path with a furrowed brow. "My dear Miss Marple, it seems quite the business," said the vicar's wife. "No sign of Mrs. Hargreaves. Her bed unslept, her supper untouched. She didn't start to come to the bakery this morning either," added Mr. Penrose, who had materialized beside them, holding a loaf he hadn't yet paid for. "She always buys rye on Thursdays. Always. Creature of habit, that one." "Perhaps she left early for a visit?" Miss Marple suggested mildly, though her eyes narrowed ever so slightly. "With no note, no luggage, no, pardon the expression, preparation?" Mrs. Litchfield shook her head. "It sits most unlike her. Most." By 2 o'clock, Sergeant Hensley had been summoned. He was a stout man with earnest eyebrows, and a fondness for ticking boxes. He stood at the widow's front door, adjusting his cap and addressing the small gathering that had inevitably formed. There was no sign of forced entry, no sign of departure, either. The back gate was latched from the inside. "Eden slept in. Shoes all accounted for. If she went out in slippers." "Slippers!" exclaimed Miss Merton, who had joined the crowd with an expression that suggested she was enjoying herself. "Then she can have gone far, can she?" "I sperm. Not saying it stands criminal," Sergeant Hensley added quickly, "but I still be making a report." Miss Marple, unassuming in her hat and gloves, said little, but she asked gently, "Was her handbag missing?" The sergeant blinked. "No, or is still by the hall table, with her purse and gloves." "Thank you, Miss Marple. I hadn't quite noted that." She nodded. "It's the little things that vanish when one leaves in a hurry, but when one disappears deliberately, well, one takes what one does not wish to leave behind." That night, the village hummed like a beehive poked with a stick. Theories abounded. She'd run off with a man. She'd suffered a spell and wandered into the fields. She'd gone to London quietly. Though why, no one could say. Mr. March, the solicitor, admitted he'd spoken with her only briefly the day before. "She asked about the deed to her house," he murmured. "Something about her late husband's affairs. Perfectly routine." "Routine," echoed Miss Marple. Her tone was pleasant, but her mind was anything but idle. By the following morning, the police had conducted a thorough sweep. No signs of struggle, no blood, no broken window panes. The cellar was dry. The garden showed no signs of recent disturbance. But something wasn't store quite right. Miss Marple asked for permission to view the house. Sergeant Hensley, feeling mildly inadequate in her presence, agreed. Just don't touch anything. She didn't start, but she looked. The sitting room was pristine. The kettle, still containing cold water, sat unused. In the hallway, an umbrella stood beside the door, dripping from where it had been used the day before. No mud tracked in, no scuff marks. Upstairs the bedroom was stark. A book lay on the nightstand, The Psychology of Grief. Its spine was barely cracked. On the dresser sat a bottle of lavender water and a neatly folded handkerchief. Everything in place. Everything paused. Miss Marple paused too. She leaned closer to the wardrobe. 2 coats hung side by side, but the third, a grey wool one she had seen the widow wear last week, was absent, not packed, not hanging, simply gone. Sergeant, she asked softly, was there a garden gate key among her belongings? Not that I've seen. Why? No reason, she said. You're just curious. It sets a difficult latch. Need both hands. She stepped out onto the back patio. The grass was dew-damp, undisturbed, but the side flower bed had a slight indentation near the lilies, a half-heel mark, almost erased. Later that day, Miss Marple returned to her cottage, put on a pot of tea, and stared thoughtfully at the ticking mantel clock. When the vicar's wife arrived, bearing scones and curiosity, Miss Marple asked only one question. Do you recall what Mrs. Hargreaves said when she left your tea party? Mrs. Litchfield pursed her lips. Something about dusk. Yes, she said. Dusk was a time for caution. Murmured Miss Marple, pouring tea. Indeed. And some people, you see, take great care with words, especially when they plan to vanish during them. Chapter 3. By Sunday morning, Widowsmead Lane had become a corridor of murmurs. Curtains twitched more frequently. Conversations trailed off when footsteps approached. The church bells rang as they always did, but even their familiar chime seemed somehow uncertain. Miss Marple walked to St. Mildred's for morning service, her gloved hands clasped around her handbag. The vicar preached from Corinthians, but his voice held a tremor, particularly when he spoke of the righteous being sorely tested. One might have forgiven him. It was not every week that a woman vanished without a trace on his very doorstep. After the service, as congregants lingered in the churchyard, pretending to admire the hydrangeas, Miss Marple found herself approached by Miss Pamela Merton, armed with a bouquet of judgments. It's scandalous, Jane, vanishing like that. Mark my words, there sits mischief behind it, and secrets. Perhaps, said Miss Marple mildly, though I've always found that secrets are most often revealed not through what people say, but how quickly they say it, and why. Miss Merton blinked at that, thrown off course. She adjusted her hat. The solicitor, Mr. March. He was seen speaking quite earnestly with her only days ago, about her will, I suspect, and now she's gone. Doesn't it seem rather convenient? Miss Marple gave a small smile. Convenience is rarely neat. More often it leaves behind ragged threads. Meanwhile, Sergeant Hensley was interviewing the widow's milkman. She didn't start to collect the bottle Friday morning, he said. It sat there all day. Even the cat didn't start come sniffing. Odd, that. And you saw no one? Hensley pressed. No, sir. Not so much as a shadow. Down the lane, Mr. Oswald March stood in his study, chewing the end of a pencil. He'd spoken to the police, of course. But there were things he hadn't said, details that felt too minor to mention, yet now weighed oddly in his thoughts. For instance, the envelope Mrs. Hargreaves had brought. It had been sealed and stamped already, addressed to an unknown party in Sussex. She'd asked him to post it, only if something unusual occurred. She hadn't elaborated. He hadn't questioned. The envelope now sat in his desk drawer, unopened. Elsewhere, Miss Marple sat down to tea with Reverend Litchfield and his wife in the vicarage garden once more. This time the atmosphere was taut, the light overcast, the flowers looked less joyful. "It scents a terrible thing," the vicar sighed. "I cannot help but feel responsible, somehow. She was here, Jane. Here, and then simply gone." Miss Marple stirred her tea, her tone quiet. There was a remark Mrs. Hargreaves made just before leaving. She said dusk was a time for caution. I wonder what she feared, what she knew might follow her home. She was never particularly close to anyone in the village, Mrs. Litchfield offered, though she had peculiar habits. He refused to join the gardening society, kept odd hours, and she was quite protective of her late husband's such photograph. Kept it locked away, someone said. "That's curious," said Miss Marple. "Why keep a memory under lock?" That evening, as twilight settled over the village once more, Miss Marple took a stroll down Widow's Mead Lane. The houses glowed softly within, but number 7 remained dark, shuttered. At the gate, she paused and looked back, mirroring the gesture the widow had made days earlier. It was not just the widow who had looked back. Someone else had been watching her go, someone with a stake in her disappearance. From behind her, a voice interrupted. "Evening, Miss Marple." It was Beatrice Litchfield, the vicar's daughter, holding a basket of sweet peas. Her face was composed, but her voice had a strange tightness. "You shouldn't be out alone," she added, glancing nervously toward the empty cottage. "Not when—" "Well," Miss Marple smiled. "Sometimes, my dear, being seen is the safest thing." Beatrice hesitated. "Do you think she sits dead?" Miss Marple did not answer at once. "I think," she said slowly, "that someone wanted her gone. Whether that means she is dead or simply vanished to serve another purpose remains to be seen." Beatrice nodded, but did not leave. There sits something strange about the whole thing. The night she vanished, when she left our tea, she dropped something, just a bit of paper, folded in her glove. I meant to give it back, but I suppose I forgot." Her fingers reached into her cardigan pocket, and she produced the folded note. Miss Marple took it carefully. Inside was a single line, handwritten in sharp ink. "He knows. I cannot speak yet, but soon." The words struck cold. "Did anyone else see her drop this?" Miss Marple asked. Beatrice shook her head. "I don't think so. I wasn't even meant to see it, really." Miss Marple folded the paper again. "You did well to keep it. Truth, my dear, is like mildew. It spreads in the dark, but shrivels under sunlight." Chapter 4. The note Miss Marple had received from Beatrice, crisp, direct, and ominous, sat tucked inside her sewing basket as Monday morning dawned, but her mind turned elsewhere. If Mrs. Hargreaves had been silenced before she could speak soon, then the identity of he might lie buried in her private affairs, or in something never meant to be found. At precisely 10 o'clock, Miss Marple arrived outside the offices of March and Biddle's solicitors. A small brass plaque by the door gleamed modestly, and a potted fern sagged in the front window. Inside, The firm smelled of ink, polish, and the mild disarray of old files. Mr. Oswald March looked up from behind his desk as she entered. His surprise was evident, but he gestured courteously. "Miss Marple, a pleasure. I was just reviewing, well, never mind. What brings you this morning?" She sat delicately across from him, withdrawing a small lace-edged handkerchief to rest on her lap. "I do hope I am not intruding, Mr. March, but I wondered if you might help me fill in some small details concerning Mrs. Hargreaves' recent affairs." He hesitated, his eyes dropping to his blotter. "Well, naturally, I can disclose confidential matters, Miss Marple." "Of course not," she agreed. "But I've always found that discretion often lives quite comfortably alongside conscience." Mr. March sighed, then reached into a desk drawer. "There is one thing I've been debating about. You see, Mrs. Hargreaves entrusted me with a sealed envelope the day before she disappeared. She instructed me to post it only if, her words, said something unusual should occur." Miss Marple inclined her head. "And has it occurred, would you say?" He opened the drawer and held up the envelope. It was sealed with red wax and addressed in careful looped script to a Reverend Charles Hammond of Sussex. She gave no indication of its contents, he said, but she did seem anxious. "May I?" Miss Marple asked, motioning toward the envelope. He handed it to her. She turned it gently in her hands, noting the fresh wax seal, unbroken, and the slight bulge of folded paper within. She didn't say whether she expected foul play. "She didn't use the word," Mr. March replied. "That she did say, very precisely, that there were things people had chosen not to see. Things she had only recently begun to understand." Miss Marple's sipped blue eyes sharpened. "People often notice things too late, and others notice them too well." He frowned. Do you think she feared someone in the village?" "I think," Miss Marple said slowly, "that she may have known something tied to her late husband's Sapper's affairs that someone else wanted buried. And perhaps," she added delicately, "that person had already tried once before to silence her." Mr. March went still. "You know something," she said quietly. After a pause, he leaned back in his chair. "There was a curious incident. A month ago, she came to me with a torn page from a ledger she found in one of her late husband's boxes. It referred to an overseas payment routed through an address here in St. Mildred, Sis, a false address. She seemed distressed, said she thought it explained a change she'd noticed in him during the final year of his life." "And what did she intend to do?" She asked whether it could be considered blackmail, he admitted. "I advised caution. I believe she wrote someone a letter that evening, though to whom, I don't know." Miss Marple tapped a thoughtful finger on her bag. "And has that ledger page been found?" "No," he said, "nor the box." When she left his office 20 minutes later, the letter was back in its drawer. Miss Marple had declined to open it, insisting instead that the police should be made aware of its existence. But she'd taken note of the name, Reverend Hammond. That name was not unfamiliar. She would follow that trail later. For now, there was something else to attend to. That afternoon, Sergeant Hensley stood in Mrs. Hargreaves' parlor, folding his notebook. "I shall admit it, Miss Marple," he said. "This one sits tangled. No evidence of struggle, but no clue she left willingly either. We dusted for prints, nothing unusual. Even the garden sits turned up blank." "She did not leave of her own accord," Miss Marple said softly. "But I don't believe she was taken by force either." not in the traditional sense. Sergeant Hensley gave her a sideways glance. You mean persuaded? Perhaps. Or frightened. She glanced toward the hall table, where a slim silver photograph frame sat askew. She reached out, adjusted it upright. She rarely kept this in sight, she said. It used to be in her bedroom drawer. Now it sits here visible, deliberate. The photo was of her husband, Gregory Hargreaves, a pale man with an intense gaze. Miss Marple studied it a moment. Some photographs are not for remembering, she said. They are for reminding. Later that day, a minor but unexpected development arrived in the form of young Tommy Litchfield, Beatrice's younger brother, a boy of 11, all knees and smudges. He knocked on Miss Marple's door with the guilty air of a dog who'd chewed a hymn book. I didn't mean to snoop, he began, but I saw something in the garden last night, at number 7. She leaned forward. Tell me exactly. I was walking back from the footpath. I'd dropped my cricket ball, and I saw someone go through the back gate, quiet-like. Didn't set use the latch, just slipped through like he done it before. Did you see his face? No, just a dark coat, tallish, but I heard him say something, just one word. What word? Tommy hesitated. He said, "Fool, Stetter," then he disappeared into the house. I ran off after that. Miss Marple looked out toward the garden path. The wind had shifted. The sky was lowering. A figure had returned to the house, but it hadn't been the widow. Chapter 5. 2 days after young Tommy's confession and the revelation of the sealed letter in Mr. March's drawer, Miss Marple sat quietly in the corner of the 10:17 train to Chichester, a modest leather handbag resting on her knees and a notebook concealed discreetly inside. Her destination, the rectory of Reverend Charles Hammond. She had made discreet inquiries that morning and discovered he was a semi-retired clergyman residing in Westbourne, Sussex, and, more curiously, not connected by church or blood to Mrs. Hargreaves. The letter addressed to him now took on added weight. Why him? The journey was uneventful, save for a brief delay outside Petersfield due to cows on the line, which Miss Marple took as a sign of rural order asserting itself even amid quiet criminality. The Reverend Charles Hammond turned out to be a man of soft hands, absent-minded manner, and eyes that had once been sharp and now seemed to forget what they had seen. His housekeeper showed Miss Marple into a parlour with worn books and the faint smell of pipe tobacco. I knew Gregory Hargreaves, he said, after she explained her connection. Many years ago, we served at the same mission post in Ceylon. His wife, Edith, never visited, but I heard of her. Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. You hadn't been in contact recently? The Reverend shook his head. Not for over a decade, which makes the arrival of her name tied to a sealed letter rather unsettling. She was afraid, Miss Marple said softly, of something or someone. She left instructions that a letter be posted to you if anything very unusual occurred. The Reverend leaned back, visibly troubled. Gregory was a complicated man, ambitious, charming. But there were whispers. Even then, the mission's funds records didn't always line up. When I quietly raised concerns, I was transferred. Later, I heard he left the mission altogether and married well. And did anyone pursue those whispers? No, they were tidied away, as such things often are, especially when the people involved know how to make documents disappear. Miss Marple gave a small nod. She found a torn ledger page, she murmured. It mentioned an overseas payment routed through a false St. Mildred set's address. You believe her husband was capable of misappropriation? The Reverend sighed. He was capable of worse. By the time Miss Marple returned to St. Mildred's say, the sky had begun to darken with the threat of a summer storm. Her thoughts, however, churned more forcefully than the clouds. Gregory Hargreaves, respected in public, questionable in private, and perhaps not the only one. Back in the village, Sergeant Hensley had received word that no activity had been detected on Mrs. Hargreaves' bank accounts. Her passport remained locked in her home. No sightings, no calls. She's vanished like steam off a kettle, he muttered, thumbing his report. But Miss Marple's attention turned elsewhere, specifically to a man who had, thus far, said too little. That afternoon, she stopped by the solicitor's office once more. Mr. March looked surprised, but not displeased. I must ask, she began without preamble, how long have you acted for the Hargreaves family? Just over 2 years, he replied. I began handling Mr. Hargreaves' sister affairs shortly before his death. Did you notice anything peculiar in those dealings? He hesitated. There was one thing, a wire transfer he asked me to arrange not long before he died. It was routed to a man named Gerald Nash. No explanation given. I assumed it was a private matter. Nash, Miss Marple repeated. And what does Mr. Nash do? I have no idea. I was simply instructed to ensure the transfer cleared and not to include it in the routine financial review. Miss Marple Sips's eyes did not leave his. Would you still have the account details? I shouldn't start. But I believe the name of the receiving bank was Addlesham and Keene, London branch. Thank you, Miss Marple said softly. That may matter more than you think. That evening, under a bruised dusk sky, she walked once more to the rear of number 7 Widow's Mead Lane. The house remained locked, empty, but the flower bed told a different story. Bending down with delicate knees and practiced hands, Miss Marple examined the half-erased footprint Tommy had noticed. Near it, concealed beneath the edge of the garden trellis, she found a scrap of cloth, navy wool, coarsely woven, torn. She pressed it between her fingers, eyes narrowing. Too thick for the widow Sips coat, she murmured, too new and torn in a hurry. As she rose, she caught a sudden movement in her periphery, a curtain twitching 2 houses down. Miss Merton's window. By morning, the cloth scrap had been sent to Sergeant Hensley, who promised, though without much hope, to have it matched to any garments found. But it was enough for Miss Marple. The story was shifting. The vanishing widow was no longer a passive victim. She had known. She had feared, she had planned, and someone, perhaps Gerald Nash, had tried to stop her too late. Chapter 6. Tuesday morning brought a restless hush over St. Mildred's Close. A thunderstorm had rolled through during the night, soaking the flower beds and leaving the hedgerows damp and sagging. Yet the air felt no cleaner, only charged, as though something still waited to break. At her kitchen table, Miss Marple turned over a scrap of navy cloth, retrieved the previous day from Mrs. Hargreaves' garden. It was thicker than her usual coats, military in its cut, and crucially, the edge was torn, not frayed, fresh damage. She placed it beside a small list of names she had scrawled in fine script: Gerald Nash, Addlesham and Keene, Gregory Hargreaves, and now the tailor's receipt, if one exists. Within the hour, she was seated in a modest shop just off the high street. The tailor, Mr. Ewing, had served the village for 32 years and remembered everything, provided one gave him time to rummage through his memories and his folders. "Blue wool, you say?" he said, squinting at the cloth she had shown him. "Yes, I recall a rather fine boat of it, commissioned 6 weeks ago, but not by a local." "Do you keep a record?" she asked. "Indeed I do. Let me fetch it." He returned with a logbook bound in cracked leather and turned the pages carefully. "Here it is, ordered under the name G.N., just initials. Paid in cash." Odd, that, and he was tense. Tall man, northern accent, asked for a tailored overcoat, told me it was seat for business up country. Seat. Did he mention where he was staying? The tailor rubbed his chin. He didn't start, but he did smell of tobacco, not local, Turkish blend, I stat say. And there was a stain on his cuff, ink, deep blue. Miss Marple tucked the cloth back into her handbag with a nod. "You've been most helpful, Mr. Ewing." She left the shop and continued down toward the Swan and Clarion, the village's only public house of decent repute. She ordered a ginger cordial and seated herself by the window, her eyes following the footpath that curved behind the widow's garden wall. Within 10 minutes, the pub's owner, Mr. Bragg, joined her, summoned by a quiet word from the barmaid. "Miss Marple," he greeted, wary but polite. "How can I assist?" "Your cleaner, Connie, I believe, is quite observant. She mentioned to me some time ago that she once saw someone come in through the side alley, not using the front door." Bragg shifted. "We had the odd discreet visitor. I once set to deny that nothing criminal." "Of course not," Miss Marple replied calmly. "But I wonder, last Thursday evening near dusk, did someone matching that tailor set's description come through?" Mr. Bragg hesitated, then nodded slowly. "A man in a long blue coat came through the alley, went upstairs. We let out rooms on occasion. No questions asked. Paid in cash. Left just before dawn, the next morning." "Did he leave anything behind?" Bragg scratched his head. "Nothing, save a matchbox and a short list of figures jotted on the corner of a newspaper, tossed in the bin. I can have a look." He returned a few minutes later with the scrap in question, wrinkled, scorched at one edge. On it were a few scribbled numbers and the phrase, "Widow's Mead Second Chance." Miss Marple's gaze settled on the phrase. "Did anyone else see him?" Bragg looked uncomfortable. "Beatrice Litchfield was here that night, had a row with her father earlier, and came in for sherry with her friend. I believe she saw the man on the stairs." That detail sat heavy. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple found Beatrice sitting behind the vicarage, watering the sweet peas. The girl looked pale, but composed. "I am afraid," Miss Marple said gently, "that the man who wore the blue coat has left the village, but I believe you saw him." Beatrice froze. "At the pub?" Miss Marple nodded. "You seen him before? Haven't text you?" "Not just that night." Beatrice Stubbs' voice was barely a whisper. "He came to see Mrs. Hargreaves twice. I saw him in the alley, slipping through the side gate. She always looked frightened after he left, but she never said who he was." "You never mentioned it to your parents?" She shook her head. "I didn't want to get involved, but now I think I should have." Miss Marple took her hand. "Involvement, my dear, often begins far earlier than we admit. It merely waits for us to catch up." That evening, as darkness settled and the scent of wet grass drifted in through the open window, Miss Marple reread her notes. a ledger page torn, a photograph suddenly on display, a letter never sent, a cloth scrap, a frightened widow who had begun to understand something she wasn't meant to know, and now a stranger in a blue overcoat, a man who had come and gone with the timing of someone used to vanishing before dawn. She picked up the list from the tailor's book again. Gerald Nash. She had heard the name once before, spoken softly by Gregory Hargreaves at a garden fete 2 years prior, when he said to Colonel Withersby, "Nash handles those affairs for me now, keeps everything quiet." So Gerald Nash had already been lurking behind the scenes. And now, one woman had vanished, and another had almost certainly seen too much. Chapter 7. Rain returned to St. Mildred's the following morning, light but persistent, the kind that made roses bow and pathways slick. The village looked subdued beneath the drizzle, its cottages hunched beneath grey skies, secrets sealed tightly behind laced curtains. Miss Marple, however, was not one to wait on the weather. She arrived at the vicarage just after 10, ushered in by Mrs. Litchfield, who seemed grateful for company. Tea was offered, but declined. "I wonder," Miss Marple said as they passed the front parlour, "if I might have a word with Beatrice alone." Mrs. Litchfield blinked. "Of course, if it sits not too serious, only as serious as human nature tends to be." Beatrice sat upstairs in her room, a book unopened on her lap. She stood when Miss Marple entered, but the stiffness of her posture gave her away. She was expecting this, perhaps had been waiting for it. "I've remembered something," she said quietly before Miss Marple could speak. Miss Marple gave a soft smile. "That's often how it begins." Beatrice looked down at her hands. "Of a man in the blue coat. I saw him leave Mrs. Hargreaves' sitted garden 2 weeks ago. He didn't sit it see me, but I recognized something. A ring, large, gold, with a dark green stone. I sit it seen it once before." "Where?" Miss Marple asked, her voice gentle. "On my father sits writing desk." There was a silence so complete, the faint ticking of the hall clock downstairs felt like thunder. "I confronted him," Beatrice whispered. "He said it was a gift from a visiting missionary, but I didn't believe him. Not after I saw that man." Miss Marple didn't press her. Instead, she waited. Beatrice sat down. "I think my father knew the man, or perhaps he said he'd done something for him. I don't think he meant to harm anyone, but I think he sits ashamed, and that makes him afraid." "Afraid of what, my dear?" Beatrice looked up, eyes hollow. "That he helped cover something up, something long ago, something Gregory Hargreaves did, and maybe Gerald Nash came to ensure it stayed buried." "And Mrs. Hargreaves," Miss Marple prompted softly, "discovered it?" Beatrice nodded. "She tried to speak to father. I heard them in the hallway. She told him she found evidence of fraud, snert that her husband had kept accounts in someone else's name, someone within the church. He didn't answer. He just told her it was best to forget the past." "Did she?" "She said she couldn't sit." That afternoon, Miss Marple visited the vicar under the pretense of donating old hymnals to the church library. He received her in his study, visibly strained, his fingers stained with ink, and his expression remote. She did not waste time. "Tell me, Reverend, did Gregory Hargreaves ever ask you to do something that troubled your conscience?" He looked at her over the rims of his spectacles. "Why would you ask such a thing, Miss Marple?" "Because your daughter saw the man in the blue overcoat, and because Mrs. Hargreaves was quite specific in her wording, she found proof of fraud. A second set of accounts, false identities, and she feared she might disappear. He set down his pen with care. It was years ago. Before I truly understood the scale of it, Gregory came to me with a request. He needed a name, an address, to facilitate a temporary transfer of funds. Said it was for the mission, and that discretion was essential. I believed him. Did you ever see those funds returned? He shook his head. By the time I asked, he claimed the books had been corrected, and I let it pass. I thought it was behind us. And then Gerald Nash came to the village, Miss Marple said. The vicar's silence confirmed it. He told me to say nothing. He whispered, said the widow was stirring up things that would ruin reputations, mine included, that it was best if she left quietly. Said it. I didn't understand what he meant until she was gone. Miss Marple studied him for a long moment, and now I've written a letter to the bishop confessing my part. Whatever happens, I won't allow more silence. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple placed the names before her like puzzle pieces on her table. Gregory Hargreaves, fraudulent missionary funds, misused identities. Gerald Nash, the enforcer or the cleaner, arriving only when buried things threatened to surface. The vicar, a man manipulated long ago and silenced by fear. Beatrice, a witness who saw too much and held back too long. Edith Hargreaves, the woman who knew and vanished. But was she dead? That night, Miss Marple dreamed of shadows moving behind the hedgerows, and when she awoke, a single name returned to her. Maureen Griggs. She had almost forgotten. Mrs. Hargreaves had once briefly employed a housemaid before dismissing her quietly. Maureen, who now worked part-time at the grocer's, reserved girl, knew how to go unseen. By mid-morning, Miss Marple had found her. I was only there a few weeks, Maureen said nervously, twisting her apron, but I saw things. She used to keep a small case under the stairs, locked. Said it was her late husband, Sit's delicacy. Sit's never let me dust it. Did anyone ever come asking about it? Yes. A man in a dark coat, looked sharp. Said he was an associate of Mr. Hargreaves. I didn't trust him, and after he left, she looked pale as chalk. Told me not to open the door for anyone after dusk. And then she let me go the next day, gave me a full week's wages in cash, said it wasn't safe anymore. Miss Marple left the grocers with more than groceries, the case, the widow's fear, the vicar's guilt, and somewhere out there, a man who thought he'd erased the trail. But trails, Miss Marple knew, never truly vanished. They only waited in the dark to be seen. Chapter 8. Wednesday evening brought a strange stillness to St. Mildred's Close. Even the birds seemed reluctant to sing, as though the village itself were holding its breath. At number 7 Widow's Mead Lane, the shutters remained drawn, the garden unkempt since Mrs. Hargreaves' disappearance. Yet inside, a quiet search had begun. Miss Marple stood in the widow's hallway, beneath the dim glow of a single gas sconce. Sergeant Hensley had allowed her access once more, reluctantly, but without resistance. He'd muttered something about her being more useful than a pack of constables. She took it as the compliment he didn't mean to offer. This time she carried no handbag, only a folded apron and a small flashlight tucked into her pocket. She moved with purpose. passing by the untouched sitting room, ignoring the kitchen, and heading straight for the narrow cupboard beneath the stairs. It was empty. At first glance, broom, mop, a folded umbrella, but it was the floorboards she cared about. She bent down and ran her fingers along the grain of the wood. One panel near the back had a faint groove-worn smooth finger pressure. Over time, she slipped a nail file from her apron and gently pried it up. The board gave with a soft creak. Beneath, wrapped in oilskin, was a small box locked but not sealed, a modest brass clasp. Inside, she found papers, 3 folded letters, a torn ledger sheet, and a packet of bank slips marked with initials not matching Mrs. Hargreaves' name. One envelope was addressed simply, "To be opened only in the event of my disappearance." Miss Marple unfolded the letter with care. "If you are reading this, then I am likely no longer in a position to speak for myself. My husband, Gregory Hargreaves, was not what he seemed. The funds he raised for foreign missions were diverted, routed through false identities, including one under the name Gerald Nash. I have confirmed that these funds passed through accounts created in our village, with the assistance, willing or otherwise, of a local clergyman. I do not believe my husband acted alone. Mr. Nash approached me some weeks ago, threatening silence in exchange for my compliance. I have hidden what evidence I could gather. If I am gone, it is because I refused to remain complicit. Please do not trust appearances. Edith Hargreaves." Miss Marple refolded the letter and slid it into her coat pocket. The ledger page told the same story. Account numbers, sums marked, donations routed to addresses that did not exist. One, in fact, listed the very same post box used by the vicar's office. Not coincidence. Not anymore. The final piece in the box was a single sepia-toned photograph. It showed Gregory Hargreaves in Ceylon, arm around a man with a narrow face and thick eyebrows, unmistakably Gerald Nash. Both men wore clerical collars. A chill pricked her spine. This was not merely fraud. This was a system built and hidden with deliberate care. Miss Marple replaced the board and emerged from the cupboard quietly. She had just closed the door behind her when she heard a sound, very slight but unmistakable. A floorboard creaked in the sitting room. She froze. No lights were on. No one should be there. She waited, breathing shallowly, then took a step forward, her fingers tightening around the small flashlight in her pocket. Another creak. Then a voice, low, male, and amused. "Miss Marple, you stir clever than most." She didn't respond. "You've been asking the right questions," the voice continued, "but you put yourself in a dangerous place, alone." A shadow shifted in the corner, tall, wearing a dark coat. Gerald Nash. "I could say I set them just here to tidy loose ends," he said, stepping fully into view. "But that wouldn't set me polite, would it?" Miss Marple's tone was calm. "Mrs. Hargreaves anticipated you. She left everything beneath the stairs. I read it. So will the police." "You won't make it out the front door," he said, eyes narrowing. "I don't intend to use the front," she said mildly. Behind her, the sharp beam of a flashlight illuminated the hallway. "Mr. Nash," Sergeant Hensley Sipp's voice rang out, firm and clear. "Step away from her, slowly." Nash froze. Miss Marple allowed herself the smallest breath of relief. She had left the back door ajar. The sergeant, always one for protocols, had followed up, just in time. By the time Nash was handcuffed and led out of the house, the rain had started again, this time heavier, more insistent, as though the sky was rinsing away the remnants of a long-hidden rot. Miss Marple stood in the garden, watching him go. "Is she dead?" Hensley asked quietly. Miss Marple looked toward the flower bed where the footprint had first been found. "No," she said, "I don't believe she is." Nash came back that night to retrieve the documents, but he couldn't seem to find them. He searched the house, perhaps confronted her, and she ran. She may be hiding still, somewhere nearby, somewhere she believed no one would think to look. "A friend, or a stranger with kindness," Miss Marple murmured. "Widows know how to disappear, especially those whose ships live too long in the shadow of men's sixth secrets." Chapter 9. The morning after Gerald Nash's arrest, Widow's Mead Lane was quieter than it had been in weeks. The tension had not vanished, only shifted, like a storm moved slightly off the coast. Miss Marple rose early, her routine unaltered, but her mind was far from settled. Though Nash was in custody, the matter of Edith Hargreaves' whereabouts remained unresolved. No body, no farewell, no sighting, she reminded herself, and Edith was not the sort to disappear without purpose. She tied her scarf, took her walking cane, ostensibly for balance, and strolled out along the lane. She passed the baker, the vicarage, the grocer's. But it was not until she reached the edge of the village, beyond the post office and down a disused path lined with overgrown hedges, that she paused. Ahead stood Wren's Hollow, a small thatched cottage, unoccupied since the death of its last tenant, a Miss Eustace, some 4 months ago. Officially, the house remained vacant while distant heirs squabbled over the estate. Unofficially, Miss Marple had observed signs of quiet habitation, faint chimney smoke in the evening, food deliveries redirected from the grocer, footprints leading to the back. She approached the door and knocked once firmly. A moment passed. Then another. Finally, the door opened an inch. A familiar face peered through the gap, pale, gaunt, alive. "Mrs. Edith Hargreaves." "Miss Marple," she said, voice hoarse but steady. "I wondered how long it would take you." Miss Marple gave a small nod. "I was hoping it hadn't taken too long." The door opened wider. Inside, the cottage was simple but clean. A fire burned in the grate. A pot of tea steamed on a trivet. There were no flowers, no ornaments, just stillness and weariness. "I left the night after the tea," Edith said, pouring tea into 2 chipped mugs. "Please don't come to the house again, Nash. He threatened me, said I had until nightfall to hand over everything. I refused. I stand already hidden the box. I fled before dusk." "And you came here?" She nodded. "I once helped Miss Eustace with her garden. I kept a key." "Does anyone else know?" "No. I used the back paths. Paid a girl in the next village to bring food under a false name." "Why not go to the police?" "Or not go to the police?" Edith met her gaze. "Because I had no proof at the time, and because I knew Nash wouldn't stop at threats. If I had stayed 1 more hour." Miss Marple sipped her tea.
"He came back, you know."
"Broke into your house, but he didn't find what he was looking for." "I did." Edith's hands trembled slightly. "And it sits all there. The accounts, the letters?" "Yes," Miss Marple said. "And your confession. I wrote it, in case I never returned." "Quite wise of you." There was a long pause, filled only by the soft pop of the fire. Edith set down her cup. Will they believe me? They will now, Miss Marple said gently. And more importantly, they will believe themselves, for no one in this village truly thought you left of your own accord. They just didn't know how to say so. By mid-afternoon, Sergeant Hensley didn't know how to say so. By mid-afternoon, Sergeant Hensley sat across from Mrs. Hargreaves in the vicarage parlour. Mrs. Litchfield brought in tea, hands shaking only slightly. You realize, the sergeant said carefully, we shall need a full statement. You shall have it, Edith replied. Every name, every transaction, including the ones that led through this parish. The vicar, standing by the fireplace, did not speak. He merely nodded. Miss Marple sat beside Beatrice, who watched the scene unfold with a peculiar mix of awe and relief. She was right all along, the girl whispered. Miss Marple nodded. Truth often waits patiently. It knows it must arrive in its own time. That evening, Miss Marple and Sergeant Hensley walked the length of Widow's Mead Lane together, the street bathed in the amber hush of twilight. Is it'll be safe now? The sergeant asked. Yes, Miss Marple replied, and soon the matter will be before the proper authorities. Fraud, conspiracy, attempted extortion. It starts not often we get something quite so layered in St. Mildred sects. I dare say you sit too pleased? She shook her head. No, Sergeant. Not pleased. Satisfied, perhaps, but never pleased when truth comes only after fear. They paused near the gate of number 7. The cottage looked just as it had, small, neat, and unremarkable. And Nash? Hensley asked. He settled talk. Miss Marple said quietly. Men like him always do, once the illusion of control is stripped away. He wasn't set working alone. Gregory Hargreaves began it, but Nash maintained it, and others will be named in due course. Hensley nodded. We still follow it all the way. You must, she said, because Mrs. Hargreaves did, even when she was alone. Especially then. Chapter 10. The morning was clear and windless as Miss Marple boarded the early train to Illiton, the cathedral town some 20 miles northeast of St. Mildred's Inn. With her handbag neatly clasped and her gloves freshly laundered, she appeared every inch the devout parishioner making a harmless pilgrimage. But she had not come for devotion. The office of the Bishop of Illiton was tucked behind the sandstone nave, accessible through a cloistered arch where ivy curled like ink upon the stone. She was received by a young curate with a nervous stammer, and ushered into an antechamber that smelled faintly of old hymnals and beeswax. The bishop, an upright man with an austere mouth and tired, intelligent eyes, entered soon after, walking with the quiet assurance of one who carried both spiritual and administrative burdens. Miss Marple, he said, offering a hand. You have come a long way. I believe the distance is shorter than the weight of what must be said, she replied. He inclined his head and gestured to a chair. Sep received a letter from Reverend Litchfield. He speaks, frankly, of past impropriety, but he also insists that Miss Edith Hargreaves is in possession of evidence that implicates others. I have, Miss Marple said, and I believe it is my duty to ensure the matter is not smoothed away beneath layers of clerical discretion. The bishop leaned back slightly. We do not protect the guilty, Miss Marple. No, she said. But sometimes silence serves them well. He did not argue. He did not argue. She placed a small file on the desk between them. Inside were copies meticulously prepared of the widow's hidden documents, the ledger scrap, the routed account numbers, and the photograph of Gregory Hargreaves with Gerald Nash. There was also a list of dates corresponding with unexplained donations from parishes across 3 counties, St. Mildred's among them. These were not isolated errors, Miss Marple said. They were constructed deliberately. Gregory Hargreaves' position in Ceylon enabled him to funnel mission funds into personal holdings, and Mr. Nash assisted him, often under the guise of clerical transfers, and a handful of others provided names, addresses, or silent approval. Some, I suspect, are still in office. The bishop scanned the papers slowly. When he spoke, his voice was solemn. This may shake more than one pulpit. Miss Marple nodded. But not the truth. That stands quite firmly, in my experience. He sighed. We will open an internal investigation immediately. The church cannot afford such rot in its foundation. I agree, Miss Marple said, though I suggest swiftness. Ash will not remain silent forever. Not now that he sits been cornered. The bishop tapped the photo gently. He was once recommended for ordination. That recommendation came from Gregory himself. Which suggests, Miss Marple said quietly, that Gregory was already planning a system. He simply needed men who were loyal or vulnerable. She stood. There sits one more thing. Reverend Litchfield, though he aided the original concealment, is now cooperating. He must not be discarded for having come forward too late. Sometimes it is only fear that keeps otherwise decent people from the light. The bishop inclined his head again. I shall remember that, Miss Marple, and I thank you for bringing this forward without spectacle. There is nothing theatrical, she said, about conscience. Back in St. Mildred's soul, the village hummed with a new kind of energy. The news of Mrs. Hargreaves' survival and Nash's arrest had spread swiftly, and reactions ranged from shocked to vindicated. Mrs. Brisket had taken to standing at her gate, greeting every passerby with, "Well, I always said something was off, didn't set I?" while Miss Merton walked the lane with a handkerchief clutched in triumph, whispering loudly, "Scandal, my dear, and in the church of all places." Miss Marple, my dear, and in the church of all places. Miss Marple returned in time for tea. Sergeant Hensley arrived not long after. "We had a telegram," he said, "from the bishop's office. A sit beginning formal proceedings. Nash has already named one former deacon as a co-conspirator. Seems the net sits wider than we thought." Miss Marple stirred her tea. War spreads quietly, but so does renewal. Hensley shifted. "There's still one thing I don't quite understand." "Oh." "If Nash came back that night looking for the box and didn't find it, why didn't he simply search the entire house more thoroughly? He had hours. He must have known she hidden it." Miss Marple looked out the window at the garden. "Because he assumed she wasn't clever enough to hide it in a place he himself would fear to look, under the floorboards. Yes. But more than that, Nash was arrogant. He believed control was permanent. People like that always look in the obvious places because they believe their pressure ensures predictability." Hensley nodded slowly. And Mrs. Hargreaves was anything but predictable. She was a widow, Miss Marple said softly, which is to say, a woman who has learned the cost of trust and how to survive without it. Chapter 11. The rain had lifted, but the sky remained overcast as Miss Marple stood once more before the weathered blue door of number 7 Widow's Mead Lane. The key now sat in her handbag, returned discreetly by Sergeant Hensley after Mrs. Hargreaves had given her blessing for one final inspection. The house, though silent, no longer felt abandoned. It breathed again, cautiously, like someone waking from a long, fearful sleep. Miss Marple stepped inside. Dust lingered on the skirting boards, but the air had changed. A faint scent of lavender. Recently opened drawers, perhaps. The rooms were unchanged since the day Edith Hargreaves had vanished. Everything in its place. Yet Miss Marple had learned by now that it was not the presence of disorder that revealed truth, but the precise way in which things remained untouched. She moved through the house slowly, eyes narrowed not in suspicion, but in recollection. There was something she had overlooked, something that Nash had overlooked, too. She paused in the small study, where a single window faced the garden. A roll-top desk stood against the wall, locked but not solid. Miss Marple had examined it before, but something now struck her. She opened the top drawer. Inside was a neat row of correspondence, tax documents, utility bills, several church letters. Beneath them, tucked into the sleeve of an old envelope, was a small bundle of keys. She had assumed them to be spare household duplicates, but now she looked more closely. One bore the faint label, "Shed." Miss Marple turned toward the garden. The shed at the rear of the property was modest, ivy-covered, and half swallowed by overgrown hydrangea. The key turned with a reluctant groan. Inside, the air was stale and cold. Garden tools hung on the far wall. A rusted watering can sat beside a stack of pots. But it was the writing desk in the corner, a desk in a shed, that stopped her. A writing desk in a garden shed made no logical sense, unless it had once been used for something other than gardening. She stepped forward and opened the narrow drawer. Inside were two items. The first, a folded letter dated nearly 12 years earlier. Its ink was faded, the paper creased from repeated handling. The signature at the bottom read, "Gregory Hargreaves, to whom it may concern. Should anything occur that endangers the arrangement, you are to contact Gerald Nash immediately. All adjustments must be made through him. He is to be paid, not questioned. The woman knows nothing. She is to remain uninvolved." The second item, a locket. Small, brass, hinged. Miss Marple opened it slowly. Inside was a photograph. Two children, fair-haired, perhaps 5 or 6 years old, standing beside a man who was unmistakably Gregory Hargreaves. On the opposite side, a strand of hair pressed under glass, and a name etched in delicate script, Clara Nash. She stood very still. Gregory Hargreaves hadn't merely worked with Gerald Nash. He had owned something that belonged to him, or worse, someone, a daughter, or a sister. She returned to the study and opened Mrs. Hargreaves' sexed final letter again. One sentence now rang with chilling precision. "I do not believe my husband acted alone." No, he hadn't started. He had acted with leverage, with silence purchased not only through greed, but blood. Gerald Nash had not merely been a partner. He had been bound to Gregory by a debt, perhaps of loyalty, perhaps of shame, perhaps through the child in the photograph. And when Edith Hargreaves had begun unearthing those buried truths, Nash had returned, not just to conceal evidence, but to protect something deeper, something that could destroy not only his name, but the name of someone lost long ago. That evening, Miss Marple sat quietly with Edith in the small parlor of Wren's Hollow. "There is something I must ask you," she said gently. "Did your husband ever speak of a woman named Clara Nash?" Edith paled. "Yes," she whispered. "A long time ago. He referred to her once while speaking to Nash. He thought I was asleep. He said, 'Sit, sit or keep quiet, Nash,' just like her mother did. Sit. I asked him later who Clara was. He dismissed it, said I sit, misheard. And you never asked again?" I was too afraid of the answer. "Miss Marple, sir." Miss Marple reached into her handbag and handed her the locket. Edith stared at it for a long time, her hands trembling. "This was his," she said. "It sat in his locked drawer for years. I never dared open it." "There is more to what they built than money," Miss Marple said. "It began as fraud, but it festered into something else. Control. Coercion. The kind of legacy that poisons everything it touches." Edith nodded, "And I nearly disappeared beneath it." "But you did instead," Miss Marple said, rising. "You stepped out of the dark and brought the truth with you." Chapter 12. The fire in Miss Marple's sitting room crackled with polite restraint, casting soft gold over lace curtains and the gentle clink of bone china. Outside, dusk once again crept along the hedgerows of St. Mildred's set, but this dusk brought no vanishing, only revelation. Across from her sat Reverend Litchfield, hands folded. Between them lay the final document, a confession, not his own, but left in his vestry box that morning, unsigned, but unmistakably written by Gerald Nash. "The child was never mine, not by law, not by blood, but Gregory made it clear. I was responsible. He forged the certificate, used her name as leverage, told me if I refused, he'd let the mission discover what I'd done to cover the accounts. I owed him my silence, or so I believed. I stayed in the background, made the transfers, arranged the names. Clara was never mentioned again, not until his wife began asking questions. Edith Hargreaves saw too much, read too carefully. When I arrived in St. Mildred's, it was only meant to be a warning. I never intended for her to vanish. She did that herself. Clever woman. I came to erase evidence, but someone else had already found it. What began as obedience became a prison, and I remained its most willing inmate." Miss Marple folded the pages with care. "A coward sets pen," she said, "but a coward sets honesty can still carry weight." The vicar exhaled. "And Clara Nash?" "We may never know her fate," Miss Marple said. "She vanished long before the widow did. Gregory sets hold over Nash hinged on her, but it sits likely she was lost even then. Perhaps she died young. Perhaps she escaped. What matters is that Nash believed Gregory could ruin him with her memory. And now," Miss Marple poured a second cup of tea, "now the bishop has the evidence. Now the ledgers are being traced, and those who helped conceal them, whether by silence or active hand, will be brought into the light." The vicar stared into the flames. "I tried to forget what I allowed. I prayed that time would redeem it." "Time softens edges," Miss Marple said, "but it never alters the line of truth." 2 days later, Edith Hargreaves walked down Widowsmead Lane again for the first time, escorted by Sergeant Hensley and Miss Marple. The villagers stepped aside with murmured greetings, respectful nods, or stunned silence. Mrs. Brisket dropped her garden shears. Miss Merton openly wept. Edith did not smile, but her eyes remained steady. She paused at her gate, resting a gloved hand on the old iron latch. "I'm not sure I can live here again," she said quietly. "You don't have to," Miss Marple replied. that you should return once, just to see that the shadow is gone." They stepped inside. Everything was still, the garden tidied, the furniture polished, a faint scent of rosemary in the air, Mrs. Litchfield's doing, no doubt. Even the broken clock on the mantel ticked once, as though stirred by her presence. Edith stood before her husband's photograph on the sideboard. "I loved him," she said, "not for the first time, and yet I was always afraid of what I didn't start to know." Miss Marple touched her arm. "He used charm, the way others use force. You weren't set blind, Edith. You were bound. And now I stum free." "Freedom," Miss Marple said, "isn't that always joyful? But it is honest." The following week, formal charges were filed against 2 former clerics and a financial intermediary tied to Gregory Hargreaves' long-dormant accounts. Gerald Nash remained in custody, his confession turned over to the Crown. Several additional testimonies emerged from distant parishes, quiet voices emboldened now that someone else had stepped into the light first. St. Mildred Setthurst, though shaken, remained intact. The Sunday bells still rang. The vicar still preached, now with more pause between words. Beatrice Litchfield began attending meetings of the village council, asking pointed questions. And the widow, Mrs. Edith Hargreaves, sold number 7 quietly. No fuss, no ceremony. She moved to the coast, anonymously, at first. But she sent a letter to Miss Marple in late autumn, written in a stronger hand than before. "I have started again. A smaller place, fewer stairs. The sea is just beyond the hedge, and when it rains it feels like everything is being washed clean. Thank you, Jane. You taught me how not to disappear." Miss Marple smiled when she read it. That evening, as the fire crackled and the evening shadows stretched across the village lanes, Miss Marple reflected on the path they had followed, from the gentle clink of teacups in a garden, through whispered threats, false identities, hidden truths, and finally at last into clarity. It was not the violence that lingered. It was the silence that had allowed it, and it was silence that had been broken. As the hour grew late, she set down her knitting, stood, and went to the window. Outside, dusk was falling again. But this time no one vanished. Only the darkness itself.